I thought I'd share something with you today that was something that was troubling me for a little while, and I'll share probably a little bit later how this came about. But first of all, I'd like to take you to the town square. Oh, sorry, that's the title of it. And that's the town square, the old town square in Prague. And I'm particularly interested in that bit near the centre that is blue, or I was. That's getting up close. But that wasn't what I wanted to see. Unfortunately, at the time, the monument to, he's sometimes regarded, if you like, as a precursor to the reformers. My German is not good, so I will not call him Jan Hus. I will call him John Huss, which is the anglicised version. And John Huss was somebody who was martyred not at that spot actually. He was actually burnt at the stake at Constance in Germany, and Prague is obviously not in Germany, but he was an earlier reformer. Now, he was part of a group in Bohemia, and he was eventually taken in front of the council because he objected to some of the things that were being taught in the church. Now, some of those things there, I obviously used the print that was a little bit too small, but I think it's there, yes. Ecclesiology. That is the role of the church. We are not saved by being members of a church. The church does not have the powers of God. The church is just an instrument in his hands, and he had a bit of a disagreement with the church of the day on that matter. The next thing was simony. If you wanted to be a leader in the church, you dug out some money, you paid some money, and you could be assured of getting a role. And he didn't think that was right. He also objected to the idea of indulgences. It's all about money, all right? If you've got money, you can do just about anything you like because you can pay for indulgences. So if I feel like going and, I don't know what, anyway, I just pay some money and I could go and do whatever that was wrong, and I could do it with a clear conscience, supposedly, because I had paid money to the church. And John Huss, he didn't think that was right, and I agree with him. And he was eventually called in front of a council, and he was asked to recant his views. And by the way, he was promised that if he went before the council, that he would be safe and nobody would harm him. All right. Well, you might be sceptical, because he got in front of the council, and when he spoke to them and they didn't like what he said, they had him declared a heretic. And guess what? If you're a heretic, you are a lower order of being, and nobody has the responsibility of keeping their word to you. You're just not worthy of that sort of courtesy. So he was brought, he was asked to recant, and when he didn't, the safekeeping assurances all went out the window, and he was placed in prison. As you can see there, he was burned at the stake, one of the unfortunate details is if they really didn't like you, they used green firewood that didn't burn very fast. And apparently that was one of the tricks that they used on him so that they could prolong the process. They obviously didn't like him, they didn't like what he had to say, and so that was what happened. Yeah. Oh yes, and it mentions there that he was heard singing psalms as the flames engulfed him, and he was seen actually, oh yes, yeah, he predicted that others would be raised up to follow up with the reforms that he had started. There's more of that on the next slide. Yeah. So one of the major things that, or major advances, if you like, that he made as a reformer was that he decided not to put his faith in the leader of the church or the council that governed the church, but he appealed to Christ as the person who was the greatest authority. And so that meant that he bypassed the church hierarchy, and of course this upset quite a lot of people. He asked to be exempted from recanting the doctrines which he had never taught. And there are other doctrines he was not willing to revoke because he felt that that would be totally going against his conscience. And his statement was, "God is my witness that the things charged against me I never preached in the name of truth of the gospel, which I have written, taught and preached, drawing upon the sayings and positions of the holy doctors. I'm ready to die today." So this was John Huss's hill to die on. And his parting words to them were, "You may kill a weak goose," because in Czech his name meant goose, "but I am but more powerful birds. Eagles and falcons will come after me." Martin Luther referred to himself as a swan. I'm not sure what the linguistics were that went with that, but he regarded himself as a swan, and he regarded himself as being a successor to Jan Hus, or John Huss. John Huss he chose a hill to die on, and it was a worthwhile hill to die on. To do otherwise would not have been true to himself or to his God. God communicates his will to us in a number of forms. And he has a number of ways of making his wishes known. And he has given us laws that apply universally. They apply to everybody at all times. There are laws that apply to certain groups, and there are laws with an expiry date. There are instructions that are given to individuals or groups. Now, just teasing some of these apart a little bit, when it comes to things that apply universally, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc., these are universal requirements. These are things that God requires of all people. Another thing that applies universally is the means of salvation. There is one means to salvation, and that is Jesus. He is the only one who can save us. He is the only one who does save us. and I will be saved by grace if I accept the provisions that he has made. So there are some things that are, if you like, not negotiable. They apply universally. All right, these requirements apply universally except where specific exemptions apply. And we might look at those in a minute. Things with an expiry date. The Lord gave to Moses a number of ceremonial requirements that pointed forward to the Messiah. When the Messiah came, guess what? They expired. There were civil requirements that applied specifically to the Jewish nation. And this one I've sort of cheated a little bit, because if you look up Deuteronomy there, it's the instructions to the soldiers that when they were camped in an army, that they would take a shovel with them, and that they were to use that shovel not to dig trenches, but to make the place sanitary. So this was a law that was given to the Israelites, if you like, as a civil law, and there were many other things like that. There's one that I've never quite understood, actually, and that's the one about not wearing a garment that has mixed materials in it. I haven't quite figured that one out, but I'm not too worried about it. Another big thing that was a ceremonial requirement was circumcision. This was given to Abraham, and it was a mark of identity for the Jewish people. And they regarded that as their, if you like, a particular identifying feature of what they needed to do. Back in those days, salvation was basically through the Jewish nation, and you had to sort of become almost a Jew if you were to be part of God's kingdom. The gospel then went to the Gentiles, and then there were some who felt that circumcision was their hill to die on, and there were others who said, well, what's the point? And, it became a huge problem. They had the council in Jerusalem, and you can see on the screen there that what they said was, we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from meat strangled, and various other things. So what they're saying is, this requirement of circumcision no longer applies. Forget about it, get on with life. Some people accepted that, some people still kept it as a hill to die on. So the civil laws applied to the Jewish nation, particularly when it was a theocracy governed by God. The details no longer apply, but we still study some of these things because some of the principles still do apply. Many ceremonial requirements pointed towards the cross, and guess when they expired? At the cross. Now, we won't go into these in detail, but there were instructions that were given for specific circumstances. Paul was told not to go to Macedonia. He was told to go to Macedonia and not to go to Bithynia. Does that mean nobody was ever to go to Bithynia? Of course it doesn't. Take a staff. The disobedient prophet, do not eat along the way. Not too sure about that next one. I'm glad that's not a general requirement. Taking the spoils from Jericho. There are various things there where there were instructions for specific circumstances. And those things apply to specific groups or specific people or groups under specific circumstances, and they were never ever intended for general application. Now, one thing about these things, I mentioned there were some things that were universal. Sometimes there are exceptions. Some people say the exception proves the rule. My father used to say the exception probes the rule. I'll leave you to decide which you like better. If an animal fell into a pit on the Sabbath day, would they leave it there to suffer for the rest of the Sabbath day? Of course they wouldn't. Besides, there was an economic implication to it, and they were very fond of their wealth. Honour thy father and thy mother. Jesus said that if somebody is not prepared to forsake their father and their mother, they're not worthy of him. There are a number of legitimate exceptions. But my last point there is to beware. There are exceptions. There is also the rule. And some of us are very good at rationalising, aren't we? We can rationalise anything that we really want to believe or do. All right, maybe it's a good time to pause here and just mention what the origin of this sermon was. I wandered into a church a long way from here and quite a while ago. And there was a conversation occurring in the church hall. It was a conversation of many decibels. It was a conversation where two people were, I don't know about communicating, but they were making noises either side of the room. And there was this fairly heated argument going on between these two people over what I would have considered a pretty trivial matter. And I scratched my head and I said to myself, is that the sort of hill that I would want to die on? But then I thought about it, well, okay, how do I rationalise these things? How do I know what is a hill to die on? Now, it would have been pointless at the time because logic would have been totally out of place in that conversation. It was all about emotions and, it was not going anywhere valuable. Two people believed that they were right. It was a principle to them that this had to be adhered to. It was to one of them. It was actually about coffee, and somebody thought it was a black and white thing. And I really didn't think it was a hill to die on, but then how do you choose your hill to die on? And I started playing actually with a fairly, I think, it can be a dangerous concept if it's taken the wrong way. But I'll put it to you anyway, and you can make up your own minds. Does God give advice? All right, if you have a look at the signs that are on my left, they're on your left too, I think, you will find that I don't have to obey those. If I'm in the ute and I see that 25 kilometre per hour sign, I know that I need to take it at about 15 if it's on a wet road. In other vehicles, I might try it at 20. But it's something that applies to the circumstances because certain vehicles can take corners at higher speeds than others. The ones at the right, you are likely to see some flashing lights if you do not comply. And the one down the bottom is just a distraction. All right. Does God give advice? How are we going for time? We might move along a little bit, actually. The texts are up there, but the gist of it is this. Samuel was getting old. Samuel had sons. Samuel was a devout prophet, a true representative of the Lord. His sons were ratbags. There's probably no other word for it. They were ratbags, and they were about to take over. Sorry? Well, we won't argue over the terminology. Okay. They weren't good people, and they were corrupt people. They were in kind they were inclined to take advantage of people. And so the children of Israel, the leaders came along to Samuel and they said, look, we don't want to be ruled by these people. We want a king. Now, that's the proposed solution. Yep. Now, whose sons were they? They were Samuel's. They were Samuel's sons. So, is Daddy pleased? Daddy is not pleased. They're my sons. So he wasn't too happy. The Lord wasn't too happy either, because they were not only rejecting Samuel and his sons, they were rejecting God. So God was not in favour. Let me see if I can just pick it up there. But the Lord said, listen to all that the people are saying to you. There's not you that they've rejected, but it's me. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. In other words, you can have your own way, but it's going to cost you. That's basically what he said. If you do this, yeah, you can do it, but it'll cost. So God gave some divine advice. Would they miss out on salvation if they went against his advice? Was it going to be the best thing for them? But God had given them advice. The advice was rejected. God granted their wish. How many good kings can you think of? They were in the minority, weren't they? Did they tax heavily? Absolutely. Did they take the best for themselves? Yes, they did. Were the people better off? No. But God granted their wish. God had given them advice. They could accept it or they could reject it. And God gave them the choice. This was not a hill to die on. God advised on the consequences of the action. The people chose otherwise. God allowed them to have their own way, even though it was not in their best interests. Be very careful how you take this one. I looked through the Proverbs and I found a number of things, and we won't take the time today, that seemed to me to be generally true, but I wouldn't have regarded them as mandates. I would have regarded them as advice. But you have to be very careful, or you can take everything as advice and you can make everything sort of any way you like. So we do need to be careful, but there are some things, these are generalisations describing what works best under normal circumstances, but there will be exceptions. Now, a dilemma. Is what is best for me always best for somebody else? Absolutely not. All right. Have we got time? All right, I'll just go over this quickly. I suffer from a vitamin B12 deficiency. If I had lived before about 1920, I would have had about 3 years to live. I was diagnosed with the deficiency in 2007, so I would not have been here as from about 2010, so that would have been the end of me. Now, the only known cure was at that stage, in 1920, there were two gentlemen who discovered that if you consumed vast quantities of raw liver, that it could extend your life. Now, I have chosen to be vegetarian because I think it is a more healthy way of life. Now, what would you have advised me to do if we were both back in, say, 1910? I've developed this deficiency and I will be dead within 3 years if I don't do something. It would depend how much you liked me, the advice you gave, wouldn't it? All right. So, would you have condemned me? This too might depend on how much you liked me. Would you have condemned me for eating raw liver if it was the only way I could have lived? Fortunately, there's a, what's it called again? Cytomine. Cytomine can be injected. And so Marilyn uses me as a pincushion about once every 6 weeks. And as you can see, I have gone a lot more than 3 years from 2007. Okay, so sometimes we need to sort of look at things and just be a bit careful. If you saw me eating raw liver, back then you probably would have said, yeah, what's he on about? But yeah, we need to be a bit careful about some of these things. Sorry, I'm not doing well on hearing at the moment. Okay, the book Counsels on Diet and Food. Why do you think the word counsels has been put in there? Interesting. Are there circumstances where it could be advantageous to eat flesh foods? There can be. Are there dangers of quitting some habits cold turkey? I knew somebody who was dependent on temazepam, and I'm told that if he had tried to quit that, just bang, that there could be some fairly drastic consequences. It was good for him to get off it, but sometimes these things need to be managed. Are there circumstances where a vegan diet is superior to a vegetarian diet? Maybe. Are there dangers in the vegan diet? There could be. So we've got to be a little bit careful about how we judge. So what do we learn from this? There are universal principles that apply in all situations. Is there a time and a place to forcefully, perhaps not forcefully, should we use persuasively, present an obligation to another person? I believe there is. Is there a time to hold back? That text refers to, what is it again, the beam, the mote in your brother's eye and the beam in your own. Bit hard to see through a beam. There is one concept, one principle that basically unlocks this whole thing. Jesus died on a hill. We're talking about hills to die on. He could have chosen not to. It wasn't a pleasant experience. It was an extremely unpleasant experience. So, why did he do it? Because he cares about us. He paid an enormous price to give us hope. He places an incalculable value upon each of us. So is he ever going to require us or tell us to do anything that's not in our best interest? I think Jesus said about knowing how to give good gifts to your children. He's not going to do it. Is he going to advise you to do anything that is not in your best interest? He's not going to do it. So, we have to trust. So what is my best pathway? God has universal laws, and if I follow these, I'll be on the right track. There are exceptions, but I am in grave danger of overdoing my reliance on exceptions. God gave laws for certain times. I'm not required to follow those laws. There are some people actually who still keep some of the feast days, But I do not believe that we're required to. There are some things about specific circumstances. I can learn from them, but I'm not required to follow them. God does give advice. He knows what is best, and it's in my interest to follow his advice. There may be exceptional circumstances, and I need to prayerfully follow God's advice. At the same time, I should not be judging somebody else about some minor difference, somebody who believes slightly different from me. Now, I'm not talking about fundamentals here. I'm not talking about, being alternative paths to salvation. I'm talking about things like coffee, for instance. All right. So I need to have my own beliefs, and I need to be solid in them. And I need to be very rigorous in the way in which I follow his advice. If somebody is clearly on the wrong track, I need to perhaps have a little word with them. There are some things we need to remember. Jesus died on a hill so that we can spend eternity with him. He gives us guidance on how to prepare to live with him. When God says, trust me, I can. But I need to respect the right of others to make their own decisions.